Hey guys, alright, today we are back with another history can't talk. Another History Matters video, this time 10-minute history, World War I and international relations. Short documentary. I have my AC going right now because it gets hot in my room. So it gets muggy. So it's not like it's actually hot, but it's more like just uncomfortable kind of heat, you know? You know what I mean? But yeah, today we are here gonna my brain's not working right now. But yeah, we're gonna learn about World War One, I guess. Well, not so much learn, but kind of see what they cover in 10 minutes. Kind of curious how they're gonna cover this in 10 minutes. Because it would take me 10 minutes just to explain the alliance system, which I'm gonna guess is what the international relations is about. Why can't I speak?
1900 and things in Europe are getting a bit tense.
Bit tense?
One reason was that a series of defensive alliances had been drawn up, meaning that the next European war was going to be a doozy.
That's one way to describe World War One. It was a doozy. World War Two was a doozy part 2.
To make matters worse, there were several areas of contention that could lead to the outbreak of said war.
Back territory.
The first was the ongoing Anglo-German naval arms race as the recently formed German...
I love that, I don't know why, but when I was in high school, I didn't really learn about the naval arms race, like at all. I think it was briefly mentioned, but like that was a huge source of tension. And honestly, you could argue that, you know, it was one of the causes of why maybe Britain was more willing to defend Belgium against the Germans, because of that increased tension, you know? But also Britain probably would have still defended Belgium because they were all about maintaining the balance of power on the continental part of Europe, because they didn't, you know, want to be usurped. So yeah.
An empire ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II sought to build a fleet large enough to challenge the Royal Navy. The second was French resentment.
I just love the faces that they have on their characters. It's so funny. I love it.
Over its loss of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany back in 1871. The third was the rivalry between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian Empire for dominance in the Balkans. And the fourth was the rivalry between Britain and Russia for control over the Middle East.
Really? That's never talked about.
Knowing that a major war was potentially on the horizon, you'd think that the great powers of Europe, these nations, would act calmly to prevent that. But you'd be wrong. Over the following decade and a bit, there were several potential sparks for the outbreak of this war. France and Britain had signed some agreements collectively known as the Entente Cordiale, which made them allies in foreign policy.
Germany is too powerful.
But importantly, it wasn't a mutual defence pact. Soon after this, in 1905, came the first Moroccan crisis, in which Wilhelm II gave his support to Moroccan independence, which upset the French because they saw it as a part of their sphere of influence. It was agreed that Morocco would stay under French influence, but with a foreign-run police force. 1907 saw Britain and Russia patch things up, where they divided the Middle East up between them. Thus, it seemed that things were calming down, but then Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia in 1908 without consulting anyone, which led to Russia getting very annoyed. More tensions erupted from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire's European territories. This led to the birth of the Balkan states, who by 1913 looked like this. By 1914, things were very tense, but fortunately nothing interesting was happening, except for a visit of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Franz Ferdinand, to Bosnia to inspect troops there. Whilst in Bosnia, he managed to get a tiny bit assassinated.
A tiny bit assassinated, huh?
By Bosnian Serb called Gavrilo Princip. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary, Franz Joseph, was unsurprisingly furious, and the assassination gave him
quite rude of you. Yes, quite.
Pretext for war. With whom? Serbia. This was because it was assumed that Serbia, whom Princip had wanted Bosnia to be united with, had something to do with it. The turmoil that followed this is known as the July Crisis. During this, Germany issued the blank check, whereby it gave its full support to Austria in any course of action it chose to take. Austria-Hungary wanted to subdue Serbia, either by diplomacy or by force, and this would almost inevitably mean war with Russia, who saw itself as the protector of all Slavs. For Germany, supporting Austria-Hungary made sense, since it had determined that if it left Russia to its own devices, Russia would become far too powerful to defeat in a war by about 1917. As such, an ultimatum with a list of demands was issued to Serbia. Serbia refused, and on the 28th of July, Austria-Hungary declared war on them, and Russia began to mobilise its military. Germany demanded they stop, they didn't, and on the 1st of August, Germany declared war on Russia. France then started to mobilise, and on the 3rd, Germany declared war on them too. The German plan for
There's you're mobilizing. Fuck you. Declare war.
The war was simple: hold off the Russians in the east, whilst a large force cut through Luxembourg and Belgium in what was called the Schlieffen Plan. The idea was that the Germans would capture Paris and force a French surrender, after which they could turn their full might on the Russians, who would take a long time to mobilise. On the 4th, Germany entered Belgium after it refused to grant the passage of German troops. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's independence since 1830, but the Germans weren't expecting the British to actually be willing to go to war for it. They were wrong. By mid-August, the respective sides of the war looked like this. You'll note that Italy hadn't come to the aid of the rest of the Triple Alliance, and the reason for this was that this was only a defensive pact, and so Italy wasn't obligated to do anything, and so they didn't.
Jerks.
So the balance of power early on favoured Germany and Austria-Hungary, together known as the Central Powers. Germany had a large population, it was heavily industrialised, and at the beginning had more men available to fight. Austria-Hungary was also there, whereas Russia on paper had a terrifyingly large army, but it was spread out, poorly trained and under-equipped. France also had a well-equipped conscript army, but it was much smaller, and Britain didn't have any conscripts at all, but instead had a fairly small but robust professional army. The German army started by quickly pushing through Belgium and
I feel, yeah, that's a great, I'm glad they mentioned that, because it's not all that talked about. Like, despite, you know, it looks as though they are greatly outmatched, but they really aren't. The German military is heavily populated, and they just have Prussian military, you know, stuff. Tradition is huge to the Germans at this point. The military of this time, you know, I think the problem that we have is that they got into a war of trench combat, and because of that stalemate, they look as if they are worse than their World War II counterparts. But no, this Germany, I would argue, is a lot stronger than the Germany that fought in World War II. This Germany could handle all these guys on its own, could handle pretty much all these guys on its fucking own, and have a chance at coming out on top. World War II Germany, I wouldn't say really had much of a chance. They were lucky for the early parts of the war.
In the zones they occupied, they brutally repressed any Belgian resistance.
And then they kind of, you know, screwed themselves by being very brutal to the Belgians, which was a bad idea.
Germany advanced to here, but it was halted at the First Battle of the Marne by the British and the French. This ended in hopes of a quick war, and the Germans retreated, where they dug in and began what the conflict is most famous for: trench warfare. After Marne came the race to the sea, in which both sides advanced north, trying to outflank each other, and after this the Western Front came to a standstill. So trench warfare heavily favoured the defenders, since in order to attack the enemy, soldiers had to go over the top and leave the safety of the trenches. They were then exposed to enemy machine guns, barbed wire, and all the other horrors of war. Both sides would spend a lot of time and money developing weapons and tactics to break the stalemate. On the Eastern Front, the Russian Empire did well at first and pushed into Germany. This advance came to a grinding halt at the Battle of Tannenberg, in which Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg crushed the Russian army. To the south, Austria-Hungary concentrated on attacking Serbia, which did not go well, and Russia advanced into the empire. Soon after this, the Central Powers received a boost when the Ottoman Empire entered the war on their side. Montenegro would also join the Entente, and by the end of the year the front lines looked like this. After this, the methods of fighting a modern war started to evolve rapidly. England was subject to Zeppelin raids, and Germany debuted the use of chlorine gas. Mid-1915 saw the Gallipoli campaign, which, spoiler alert, ended in disaster. This was where the Entente tried to strike at the heart of the Ottoman Empire, but again, defensive warfare was easier and a lot of people died for nothing. 1915 also witnessed the sinking of the Lusitania, a passenger ship which was carrying people and weapons to Britain from the United States. The sinking was part of the German naval doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare, in which German U-boats would attack shipping indiscriminately in the hopes of starving Britain out of the war. Soon after, Italy joined the war on the side of the Entente. The Italians failed to advance quickly into Austria-Hungary, and so, trench warfare. The war wasn't just limited to Europe, though. Troops of the British and Russian empires were advancing into Ottoman lands, and both sides clashed in Africa as well. Japan also joined the war and nabbed all of the German colonies in the Pacific, and Australia captured Guinea. Late 1915 saw Serbia finally fall, but not until Bulgaria joined the Central Powers and invaded from the south. The Russians, who had been struggling for a while, were now in mass retreat, and so Tsar Nicholas II decided that he would take personal charge to fix things. 1916 saw Montenegro conquered, the failed Easter Rising in Ireland, and attempts by both sides to break the—
Oh my god, they mentioned the Easter Rising? In a 10-minute video? That's awesome!
The deadlock on the Western Front. The Germans launched the Battle of Verdun, during which lots of people died for a whole load of nothing, and later the British launched the Battle of the Somme, which was more of the same. Soon after this, Romania—
There's pretty much World War I summarized. A whole lot of dead for Fucking nothing.
Entered the war and was swiftly conquered. This was also the year that saw the main British and German fleets clash at the gargantuan Battle of Jutland, in which Germany attempted to break British naval dominance. They did not. Soon after this came the Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front, which saw the Russians push back to here. Also, Franz Joseph proved that he could actually die and was succeeded by Charles I. 1916 was important from a technological standpoint because it saw the introduction of the tank by the British, and they were largely effective when they weren't breaking down, that was. So by 1917 everyone was getting a bit tired of this war stuff, but not much could be done since both sides wanted to remake the balance of power in Europe, which the other side could never accept. The Central Powers wanted Europe to look like this, and the Entente wanted this. The discontent with the war was particularly strong in Russia, and February saw rioting, which soon became the February Revolution. This saw Nicholas II abdicate and Russia become a republic. The new provisional government there would importantly not end the war. Discontent wasn't limited to Russia though. Austria-Hungary was basically coming apart at the seams, and in Germany political pressures were dividing the country. This was exacerbated by the British naval blockade, which prevented Germany from importing the food it desperately needed, which induced hunger and starvation in certain parts of the country.
There is no
Woodrow
food.
Wilson, the recently re-elected president of the United States, was keen to stay out of the war but had sympathies to the Entente. After some more unrestricted submarine warfare and finding out about the Zimmermann telegram in which Germany invited Mexico to invade the US, America joined the war against the Central Powers. Greece, after a lot of pressure, joined the war on the side of the Entente. The late year also saw the October Revolution, in which the communists seized control of Russia.
Skipping through the fields, yeah.
Then withdrew from the war, and after long negotiations with the Central Powers, Russia ceded this territory in 1918. Germany then launched the Spring Offensive against the Entente to win the war before too many Americans arrived. A lot of people died, some land was taken, nothing changed, and the war dragged on. Austria-Hungary continued to break down, and most of the fronts were still a stalemate. In southern Europe, Greek, Serbian, British and French troops advanced into Bulgaria, which had its own disgruntled population, and so it signed an armistice. The British were now advancing into the Ottoman Empire with the help of its rebelling Arabian population and the neighbouring peoples under the guidance of T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia. The British had secured their help by promising them this land. The British...
And then And we wonder why there's so much tension in the Middle East. The amount of times we have backstabbed the people there. Or, well, mainly Britain and France. Fuck Britain and France. They did this. They caused that. The amount of promises that they made to the people that live there and then fucking did nothing for them. Fuck the British and French.
Had lied. By late October, the Entente had captured the important city of Damascus, and the Ottomans signed an armistice on October the 30th.
You win.
4 days later, after the Italians had finally pushed into Austro-Hungarian territory, Charles I signed an armistice, and about 6 seconds later, the empire fell apart. Realising the war was lost, Wilhelm II abdicated, and on November the 11th, Germany signed an armistice. The war was over. In 1919, the peace was formalised in the Treaty of Versailles, which limited the size of Germany's armed forces, demanded hefty reparations, and reduced its territory to this. The Treaty of Trianon divided the Hungarian half of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and gave territory to Romania and the new kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, later known as Yugoslavia. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye divided the Austrian half, creating Czechoslovakia, giving territory to Poland and also Italy, but not as much as they had been promised. Bulgaria was stripped of this territory, and the Ottoman Empire was supposed to lose this. The Turks refused to accept.
It's just crazy, like, how drastically land fucking changed after World War One, but then went almost back to what it was pre-World War One with a lot of those borders. Obviously Balkans excluded, but like with Turkey would go on to take a lot of that land that had been stripped from them, at least in Anatolia. They obviously want to go past Anatolia, and you know. And then, of course, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Germany does a thing, to get that land back, and then loses it again a few years later.
A war broke out, the Turks won, and this became the Republic of Turkey, with the rest of the empire's territories going to Britain and France. The war had seen about 8 million military dead, with Russia, Germany, and France seeing the lion's share. The war had been started over imperial pride, and millions of men had...
But what I think they... If you connect it back to the amount of population that they had... Here, let's take a look at that number again, because this is very important here. So if we remember the numbers that they showed at the beginning of the video, Germany has roughly 67 million people, or whatever, at the start of the war. They only lost 1.8 million of that, which is still a heavy number. Russia has more people than Germany and only lost 1.7, so that's not as bad. but I don't think this is counting the loss of lives during the revolutions, the February and October revolutions, and thus the subsequent civil war between the Reds and the Whites. But France, though, France had a population of 30-some million, and they lost almost as much as Germany, despite having half the population of Germany at the time. This here is arguably one of the primary reasons why France was not ready and able to hold back the Germans when World War II came. 20 years was not enough time to recuperate this loss of life because of also the sheer economic loss that occurred post-war for the French. Because France was devastated. Britain, not so much. Britain was able to survive, but Britain was not able to survive World War II because the toll would affect them heavily in World War II. It would not affect them like in World War I. But it heavily affected the French. And I'm honestly kind of surprised that the French were able to hold on to their international territories and colonies after this war because of the sheer amount of dead and economic just downturn that they took.
Lion's share. The war had been started over imperial pride, and millions of men had died in the vain hope of bringing their generals and emperors glory and a quick resolution to the war. Tactical inflexibility combined with revolutionary methods of war meant that scores of men who didn't have to die did. So with such a heavy price paid, what did the war achieve? Honestly, not much.
Yeah.
It had brought about the death of 4 major empires and the rise of new nations from their ashes. Ultimately, World War I's greatest legacy was that it created the conditions necessary for the outbreak of World War II. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
I think that was a perfect... I don't think you could cover World War I any better in 10 minutes than they just did. Or, well, 9 minutes and 40 seconds. This was fucking fantastic. Obviously, there are some things that they had to brush over, such as the Easter Rising. And the Easter Rising is very important in terms of understanding British relationships with their colonies. It helps get an understanding of certain tensions inside of the British Empire. But that's not necessarily related to World War I. And then, of course, brushing over, what I was talking about there just a minute or so, a few seconds ago, which was the loss of life in France, which would necessitate or bring about the conditions where they were way too weak to defend themselves in World War II. So, yeah. I really don't think you could cover it any better. Obviously, they did not really talk much about Japan's role and how Japan conquered Germany's former colonies in the Pacific, but I don't think that's really all that important. It really didn't do much. So, yeah, it wasn't that important of a thing. Because despite this being a world war, pretty much all of the important fighting was in Europe. I mean, there was conflict happening in Africa, but it's not like the fighting in Africa was going to turn the results of the war. What was going to change the war was the success in Europe. So, yeah. But yeah, that was 10-minute history, World War I, and international relations. Short documentary by History Matters. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.